Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Teresa Singleton, and I am the Senior Vice President of the Community Development and Regional Outreach Department and the Community Affairs Officer for the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. I am excited to welcome you all to today's event, which will feature a critically important discussion about state and local eviction prevention strategies. Before jumping into today's program, on behalf of Jimmy Gassner, today's organizer, as well as others in our department, I'd like to thank our partner for this webinar, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and to our amazing speakers who have collaborated with us on the design of today's event. I need to start with a few housekeeping items. While many things have changed with how our team hosts events due to the pandemic, one thing remains the same. Before we begin, I must offer the standard Fed disclaimer. The information, analyses, and conclusions set forth are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, or the Federal Reserve System. Additionally, please note that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted online soon after today's session. We are also very interested in engaging with and hearing from you. I encourage you to type any questions or comments that you have into the Q&A box at any time. And as time permits, our speakers will address your questions. With that out of the way, I'd like to jump into today's conversation and just offer a few framing remarks before getting into the program. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia is committed to ensuring that the economic recovery from this pandemic is not only strong, but inclusive. To that end, we have engaged with stakeholders across the 3rd District, hosted a number of virtual events, and produced research to help us better understand and address existing racial and economic disparities that the pandemic has only exacerbated across our district and across the nation. Understandably, a lot of public focus has been on the health, employment, and small business impacts of the pandemic. However, we are all here today because of our collective concerns about the potential wave of evictions and the threat housing instability poses to any effort to build a more equitable system going forward. Now, as all of you are probably aware, the Center for Disease Control issued a temporary halt to evictions, and it seeks to protect up to 45 million households from being evicted through December 31st, 2020 because of lack of income. However, this merely delays repayment of rent, setting the stage for a possible wave of evictions at the end of the year. These evictions would likely exacerbate existing disparities. Research from before the pandemic clearly highlighted that women of color living in poverty face the highest risk of eviction. And research produced by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia has found that renters, householders of color, and single women are the most vulnerable to experiencing income deficits following COVID-related job losses. State and local governments are uniquely positioned to respond to these concerns, and many have taken bold steps in trying to tackle not only the crisis before us, but also the systemic issues the crisis has revealed. With or without additional federal action, it is clear that states and localities will need to implement programs and policies that can help address these issues and prevent vulnerable residents from losing their housing. Now, today's webinar is part of a larger conversation about what states and localities can begin doing to address this impending crisis. Our partners at the Cleveland Fed are planning a subsequent event to further this discussion. And please know that the community development function across all 12 reserve banks, as well as the Board of Governors, remain committed to working with you and your partners to help increase the housing stability of low and moderate income renters. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. And before we go to our panel and to our research presentations, I want to turn things over to our esteemed guest, Diane Yantel, President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Diane is going to provide us with a federal update, and her remarks will set the stage for today's research presentations and panel discussions. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Teresa. Thanks so much for the introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here during such an important conversation and during such a consequential time, a time when it's very clear that if Congress and the White House don't act and don't act soon, that we will face a housing crisis in this country unlike any that any of us have seen in our lifetimes. Next slide, please. So to best understand the scale and the scope of the current eviction crisis, created by COVID-19, we have to recognize where we were before the disease even came to our country, and that was in the middle of a severe affordable housing crisis, where we had a shortage of over 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income renters. So another way of saying that same number is for every 10 of the lowest income renters, there were fewer than 4 apartments affordable and available to them. And you can see from this map that the shortage ranges from most severe to least severe, but there is no state that has a sufficient number of apartments that are affordable to its lowest income renters. So because of this shortage, we had nearly 8 million of the lowest income renter households, so over 20 million people, who were paying at least half of their income each month to have a roof over their heads. And many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their income for their home. So when you have such limited income to begin with, and you're paying so much of it for your home, you are always one financial shock away from missing rent and facing eviction, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. Next slide, please. So for many of these same renters, the coronavirus is that financial shock. They've lost jobs, they've lost hours at work, they've lost wages, and it's harder than ever for them to cobble together what they need to make rent. Next slide. So if we had a system in our country to catch people when they fall off of a financial cliff due to any kind of disaster, and especially one like COVID-19, we could better weather these challenges. But of course, we don't have such a system in our country. Instead, we have one where only 1 in every 4 households who is eligible for and needs housing assistance receives any. So 75% of people who need housing assistance get none, and instead they wait in line, adding their names to years, sometimes decades long waiting lists, hoping to win what's essentially a housing lottery system, where only the lucky 25% gets the help that they need. So because we have such gaping holes in our social safety net, now we're faced with some tremendously challenging scenarios, like what happens when people sleeping in encampments and don't have access to soap or hot water face a pandemic? And what happens when millions of people are on the cusp of losing their homes at a time when our collective health depends on our ability to stay home? Next slide, please. And what happens when decades of structural racism collide with a deadly pandemic? So the current crises have heightened the threat of eviction for Black and Latino renters, but that threat is certainly not new. We've had decades of racist housing policies that purposefully put homeownership out of reach for many Black Americans. And that created this yawning generational wealth gap, where today the average white family holds 10 to 12 times as much wealth as the average Black family. This creates tremendous racial disparities in housing and homelessness. So structural racism leaves people of color disproportionately low income, disproportionately likely to be renters and to be rent burdened, and disproportionately likely to experience homelessness. These inequities then compound the harm done by COVID-19. So Black and Native Americans are bearing the brunt of infections and fatalities, and Black and Latino workers are bearing the brunt of these historic job losses. And now their homes, and with it, their ability to keep themselves and their families safe, are at risk. So these facts really heighten both the urgency for action to prevent a wave of evictions that will primarily be Black and Latino renters. And it really makes clear our collective obligation to center racial equity in our response to the housing needs of COVID-19. We have to be sure not only that we don't worsen or reinforce racial inequities in our response, but that we utilize all of these new dollars that are going to cities and states to instead reverse and correct disparities. Next slide, please. So the solutions to all of this are actually pretty simple, even if they're not easy, right? We have to protect and house people who are experiencing homelessness. We have to prevent more people from becoming homeless. And we have to center racial equity in all the work. Next slide. So the CARES Act was a good start. Many of you here today and across the country joined advocacy, and together with our congressional champions, we achieved about $12 billion in housing and homelessness funds and a partial eviction moratorium. And these and other resources from the CARES Act, including unemployment insurance and stimulus checks, and together with a patchwork of state and local eviction moratoriums, kept many people housed. Next slide. But now many of these resources and protections are gone. And the patchwork of state and local eviction moratoriums have mostly expired. The federal eviction moratorium, the CDC moratorium, is important, but it's flawed, and some evictions are continuing, and it expires on December 31st. And in the meantime, renters are accruing tens of billions of dollars in rent arrears and late fees. Next slide. So there is some limited assistance available. Many communities used the CARES Act and other funds to create emergency rental assistance programs. So the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, we've been tracking all of these programs. You can go to our website. There's a database with about, at last count, we were tracking about 440 programs throughout the country. And you'll see in that database that there's a lot of diversity in these programs in terms of who is being served and how the programs operate. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. But the one overarching problem that all of these programs have in common is limited resources. At 30% of these programs have already shut down, despite growing need. And some of them had to shut down within hours or even days as demand overwhelms resources. Next slide, please. So much more is needed and is needed urgently. The good news is that the eviction crisis is not only entirely predictable, as we and many others have been predicting it for 7 months, it's completely preventable. Right? The solutions also here are simple, even if they're not easy. We need a national moratorium to stop all evictions for non-payment of rent for the duration of the pandemic. The very least that governments at all levels ought to do in the middle of a pandemic is assure all of us that we're not going to lose our homes in the middle of it. But moratoriums on their own aren't enough, because eventually they do expire. They create a financial cliff for renters to fall off of when back rent is owed, and they're no more able to pay it then than they are now, or they were at the beginning of the pandemic. So the moratorium has to be paired with at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. And we need $11.5 billion in grants to homeless shelter and service providers to keep people who are experiencing homelessness safe and healthy, and to get them housed as quickly as possible. Together, these solutions would stem the tide. Next slide, please. But the bad news is that preventing the crisis actually requires that Congress and the White House agree on something and act. And at this point, that's very unlikely. And it's unlikely, unfortunately, for months. So these solutions that I just mentioned, they've passed the US House of Representatives, not just once, not just twice, 3 times. And there are bills in the Senate to do the same. There's nearly unanimous Democratic support at this point for these solutions. And there is growing Republican support for some of the solutions. And thanks to all of the work and all of the advocacy of partners across the country, and thanks to congressional champions like Senator Sherrod Brown and Representative Maxine Waters, emergency rental assistance is on the table in negotiations. And the two sides are actually not very far apart on the amount. But the problem is getting a larger deal. And Pelosi and Mnuchin are negotiating, and maybe they'll get to a deal any day, maybe any minute. But the likelihood of a big COVID-19 relief package getting through the Senate before the election is very slim. And depending on the outcome of the election, it may be very unlikely for it to happen this year. So we are looking at the very real possibility of no new emergency rental assistance provided by the time the CDC eviction moratorium expires. And then we face the possibility of tens of millions of people losing their homes in the dead of winter and at the peak of a coronavirus surge, which would be catastrophic. Next slide, please. So I was asked to share, what can you do? What can everybody do right now? And there's a lot that you can do. First, we have to get the word out on the CDC eviction moratorium. It's not perfect, but it is keeping many, many people who would otherwise lose their homes housed. But renters have to know about the protection. They have to take action to receive it. So help us spread the word to every renter about the protection. We have fact sheets and declarative statements translated into 14 languages on our website. Please distribute widely. Also, governors and mayors should act. Don't wait for the federal government to act to protect renters in your states and in your cities. You should establish, reestablish, or extend state or city eviction moratoriums. Just yesterday, the governor of Colorado showed tremendous leadership in re-implementing an eviction moratorium, and I hope that many other governors and mayors follow suit. Also, spend all the money that's available and spend it on emergency rental assistance. Incredibly, there are coronavirus relief fund dollars and CDBG CV dollars that have not been allocated yet. So spend all the available resources, use it for emergency rental assistance, and target those limited resources to the people who have the greatest and the most urgent needs, which are extremely low and very low income renters. Next slide, please. And of course, we have to keep pushing Congress and the White House to enact real solutions. We can't accept from them or from ourselves anything but success here, because the consequences of failure are too grave. The stakes couldn't be higher right now. Without a significant federal intervention, there will be a wave of evictions and a spike in homelessness across the country. And in many ways, that eviction wave has already started, and we have to act to prevent it from becoming a tsunami. And really, we are just about out of time. And when our collective health depends on our ability to stay in our homes, we all have a stake in ensuring that tens of millions of renters don't lose theirs. So thank you all for your good work and your advocacy. And thanks again very much for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to the rest of the conversation. And Teresa, I'll turn it back to you.
And thank you so much for those informative remarks. Really appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear from Hal Martin, a policy economist from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, and then Davin Reed, a community development economic advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Hal is going to share some updates from the Cleveland Fed's eviction monitoring tool, and then Davin will present some key findings from his newest report, which provides estimates of the number of households with rental debt and the amount of debt owed resulting from employment losses attributable to COVID-19. Links to each of these resources will be available in the webinar's chat function, and any questions will be addressed if time permits. With that, I'll turn things over to Hal.
Thank you very much, Teresa. It looks like everybody can hear me all right. I want to reiterate what Teresa said at the top of the program, that the opinions I express here, because I'm a Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland employee, are mine and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, nor necessarily those of the Board of Governors. And if I could have the next slide. And we'll actually do the next slide. All right. What I'm going to share with you today is research we've been doing since shortly after the pandemic began. We have been measuring eviction filings in court systems to see how they have evolved alongside the renter protections during the pandemic. What we did was to collect filing counts of court cases in 63 places that we could get our hands on data, and to monitor two types of local protections: bans on eviction filings and bans on eviction proceedings. I'll take the next slide. I'll put what we're doing in the context of the eviction filing process. This typically starts with landlords issuing a notice to vacate to the tenants, and then shortly after that, filing a court case. The court case then proceeds to a hearing, and if the landlord's successful, they receive an order of possession, and law enforcement officers act to remove the tenant. Next slide. What we're doing is we're measuring evictions at the stage of the landlord filing a court case. And we are capturing policy that intercepts this process in one of two places. Either filing bans, which we characterize as these temporary protections that stopped most filings that were related at least to pandemic or non-payment reasons, and those are shown in red, or proceeding bans, which interrupt the process later in the stage than we are measuring, but then nonetheless many jurisdictions put in place. Next slide. As you can see, most of the places that we track put some sort of protection in place, either a proceeding ban or a filing ban, early in the pandemic. But since mid-May through mid-June, many of the places that we track have had such policies expire. I'll take the next slide. So one of the things we can see when we take this framing is what happens when these local protections expire to eviction filings. Here on the left, you see the average eviction filings in the weeks before and after a preceding ban expires, with 0 marking the week in which that ban expires. While there is a short-term increase in the couple of weeks following such an expiration in eviction filings, the overall level of evictions is not much changed in the weeks before and after the ban expires. Contrast that with what happens when a filing ban expires over on the right. In the weeks before, filings are understandably close to 0. After all, it's a filing ban. What's notable is that evictions do not rise substantially above the level in the places where those eviction filings in such places don't rise substantially above the level that they were at in places that had only preceding bans in the weeks following a filing ban expiring. What that suggests is that there were not makeup evictions that were coming in following the expiration of a filing ban. I'll take the next slide. Over the course of the pandemic, we see that even in places without active hearing or filing bans, eviction filings remain below 2019 levels for most of the time. This is likely in part due to other policies that are supportive of renters. In Cleveland, for example, filings remain below 2019 levels even after the filing and hearing bans expired. We've seen courts encourage landlords to enter mediation, tenants to seek out rent relief funds, and an innovative right to counsel policy come into place even without the filing and hearing ban. Next slide. One other thing I want to comment on is the CDC order at the beginning of September. Many of us wondered whether this would reduce filings dramatically after it came into effect. It turns out that it hasn't, although it does appear that there was a moderate spike in filings in anticipation of the order going into effect. This story actually varies from place to place, suggesting that how localities implement the order affects how cases are filed following it. Next slide. I'll conclude with a few caveats. It's clear from our data that the details of local policy responses matter in understanding how they've helped to contain a potential eviction crisis. I also want to be clear that while the filings appear to be below 2019 levels, we don't have a complete picture of displacement in our research because we don't measure the outcomes of cases and we don't measure informal evictions during this time. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague in Philadelphia, Davin Reed.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hal, and thanks to everyone who helped organize. So the report I'll discuss today was written with my colleague, Eileen DeVringy, and given the time constraints, I'll just provide a high-level summary of what we found. And then the full report, which is linked to at the end of the presentation, will have many more details and specific results, including results by state. So our goal in this report was to understand how many households may be at risk of eviction because of COVID-19 related job losses. So as Diane was explaining before, and as you all are aware, moratoriums have been put in place to prevent people from being evicted at this time. But they also make clear that when those moratoriums expire, households will have to pay back in full any rental debt that they may have accrued. And while many policies have been put in place to replace lost incomes for households experiencing unemployment, those are likely to be insufficient for various reasons. Right? So we really want to understand when these moratoriums start to expire, either at the end of this year or even if they're extended into early next year. At all those points in time, how many households may be at risk of eviction because they owe rent, and which types of households these are. So I'll just highlight a few key features of our approach that are important for understanding what we do. So we start with a national data set of millions of people who are working before COVID-19. The data include information on their actual stated incomes, the occupations they work in, and various characteristics about them. It also includes how much they say they pay in rent. And then we bring in data on household spending and savings, which go into our calculations. With this data set, we'll then simulate monthly job losses for these individuals and potentially gains using data on aggregate employment changes within a state and an industry, and also data on occupational risk of job loss, right, to reflect the fact that certain workers in certain occupations have been disproportionately impacted. We're going to use that to forecast any resulting household rental debt by month under various policy scenarios. Right? And just two quick caveats to make, and we talk about these more in the full report. One, we're excluding financial distress that's not caused by job loss, right? So all of the pre-existing financial stress that Diane spoke about is not really baked in here. We're really focused on what's happening specifically because of COVID-19. And we're only calculating these rental debt that's accruing that would have gone to pay rent, right? Because again, we're really focused on when a moratorium expires and say you're taken to court, how much will you need to pay to stay in your home? Just to give you a sense of the big picture, we have about 32 million renter households with at least one worker before COVID-19 hits. And we're going to find that about 7.5 million of those experienced some unemployment between March and August of this year. So getting into some of the results, the first thing we do is kind of try to understand under different policy scenarios what the situation, what these rental debt outcomes would look like. So in this figure, each panel represents a different rental debt outcome. So for example, the top left is the share of all households with debt by month. The top right is the total number of households with debt by month. And then within each of these panels, we have one of 5 different policy scenarios. So the green line represents a scenario in which no one receives any income replacement policy at all. And at the other extreme, the red line would represent the outcome if every household were to receive both CARES UI and economic impact payments. And so you can start to see just how much each of these different policies is doing or not doing to prevent rental debt, right? So in the top left panel, for example, you see the green line, if none of these unemployed households receive any income replacement, the situation gets quite dire. By contrast, if everyone were to receive CARES UI and the stimulus payments, that would remain actually quite low through most of the year until UI starts to expire in early next year. And this raises a key question, right? So to understand the actual overall picture of rental debt, we really need to understand how many households are receiving each of these policies. So the next thing we do is we try to estimate from different sources how many households are receiving unemployment insurance, and then 2, how many households receive stimulus payments. So we estimate from census data that about 50% nationally of all unemployed households receive unemployment insurance, either state or federal. And then we also assume that 90% of households receive stimulus payments. And so this green line blends the different policy scenarios I just showed you previously, using those numbers to give you the overall picture of each of these rental debt outcomes. And this yields some of our headline numbers. For example, that 1.3 million renter households will have some debt by December, which represents about 4% of all renter households. And those households contain about 3.9 million individuals. Average debt by December for these households will be about $5,400, which in our data is about 5 months of back rent. So the next thing we do is that we take that green line and we break it out by some household characteristics. So there are more details on this in the report. I'm gonna have to go through kind of quickly here because of the time. But this is what happens when we break out that green line by the race and ethnicity of the householder. You can see that debt outcomes for Hispanic households are disproportionately impacted. And then Black and other non-white, non-Hispanic households are kind of in the middle there, with white and then white and Asian households experience the smallest declines, which again is reflecting that certain households were more impacted by job losses. We do the same thing by household type. This yields the finding that female-headed households are probably disproportionately going to be impacted. And we talk a little bit more in the report about why that could be particularly difficult, given the slow pace of the recovery and difficulty accessing childcare and other resources to help those people get back into work. And just some of our policy takeaways. The headline numbers, again, to reiterate, there seems to be a lot of unmet need still out there. The second key takeaway is that UI with CARES provisions does seem to be very protective for those households who receive it. So a natural thing to think about is, a lot of these provisions have either already expired or will be expiring by the end of the year, as most states hit their 39-week unemployment insurance limits. So extending those would be a way to prevent debt outcomes from ticking upwards into early next year. And then finally, as Dan also mentioned, we're find a lot of evidence that the households most in need are those not receiving unemployment insurance of some kind. So making state and local policies available specifically to those households and being very careful about program design to make sure that households who need these policies can receive. And so here are the links to report, and please reach out if you have any questions. We're always available. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hal and Davin. We have a number of really good questions that have come in through the Q&A, and we encourage you to keep the questions coming. The panel is going to address some of these, and so we're going to go ahead and transition over. So I'd like to now introduce Monique King-Veland, Director of State and Local Housing Policy at the Urban Institute. Monique will moderate a conversation among an all-star lineup of speakers who will share their perspectives about what can be done at the state and local levels to prevent evictions. Monique, thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. And I'm going to ask the panelists, please, to turn on their videos as well. Good afternoon. As Teresa mentioned, my name is Monique King-Veland, and I'm the Director of State and Local Housing Policy for the Urban Institute. Immediately prior to joining Urban, I was the Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Development Authority, where I oversaw the affordable housing capital funding, public housing, and voucher administration for unincorporated Los Angeles County and dozens of local jurisdictions within the county. So I spent the last 5 years on the front lines of the county's battle with housing affordability and homelessness. The fact is, and I think as Diane so clearly articulated, COVID has laid waste to a housing infrastructure already in crisis, fueling housing instability and insecurity for millions of Americans. Unemployment has surged between February and April. 1 out of every 5 rental households nationwide had at least one member who lost a job. Studies aimed at quantifying the impact of COVID-related job loss and economic hardships on renters' ability to pay rent indicate that between 29 to 43% of renter households were at risk of eviction even before the CDC order was issued. Moreover, the global pandemic has disproportionately impacted Black and Latinx populations, widening racial inequities and creating unprecedented economic hardships. Black and Latinx people faced higher levels of eviction and housing instability even before the crisis. And all signs point to a greater risk of eviction during the pandemic. In July, as state and local moratoriums expired, eviction filings returned to pre-pandemic levels. Even with the recent CDC moratorium, which faces legal challenges and does not provide additional resources for rental assistance, as Diane mentioned, the rent will come due. So this conversation is frankly more than timely. And I'm honored to have been invited by the Philly and Cleveland Feds today and to be joined by some incredible individuals for this panel. I'd like to welcome our panelists and tell you a little bit about them. Emily Benfer is a visiting professor of law and the director of the Health Justice Clinic at Wake Forest School of Law. Currently, Professor Benfer is the chair of the American Bar Association's COVID-19 Task Force Committee on Eviction and co-creator of the COVID-19 Housing Policy Scorecard with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. She is the principal investigator in a study of nationwide COVID-19 eviction moratoriums and housing policies. Ingrid Gould-Ellen is the Paulette Goddard Professor of Urban Policy and Planning at the NYU Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service and faculty director of the NYU Furman Center. She has published numerous articles and books on affordable housing, racial segregation, and urban policy more generally. And last but certainly not least, Stockton Williams, who is executive director of the National Council of State Housing Agencies, has more than 25 years of experience in affordable housing development, finance, and policy in the federal government, private sector, and national nonprofit organizations. So please join me, virtually of course, in welcoming our panelists. For context, I think it's important to talk about what our housing infrastructure looked like before the pandemic. Our research at Urban has revealed that housing affordability remains a huge challenge in many local housing markets across the country. Nationally, home prices remain affordable by historic standards, with just 22% of median income needed to pay the median monthly mortgage. But the lower end of the market suffers from high prices brought on by limited supply. Home prices in the lowest 20% of the market increased 94.3% from 2001 through the first half of 2019, compared with just 62.6% in the top 20% of the market. At the same time, a renter working 40 hours a week and earning the minimum wage could not afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any county in the United States. So I want to start with Ingrid. Ingrid, you've done some work around the rental housing crisis in cities across the country. Can you talk a little bit about the housing crisis we are facing pre-COVID and how COVID has actually exacerbated that crisis?
Sure, happy to do so. And I'll be quick because I think, Diane gave a really powerful summary of the challenges that we faced prior to COVID. But in brief, let me just say that, we talk a lot about the housing crisis and the affordability crisis along the coast in cities like New York, where I live. But in fact, we've seen mounting affordabilities in cities throughout the country. And in rural areas. Nationally, between 1960 and 2018, the median income for renters rose by about 18% after controlling for inflation. But meanwhile, the rents that they had to pay rose by 85%, right? That's not good math. And as a result, right, if you look at the percent of renters who are rent burdened or paying more than 30% of their income on rent, that rose from less than a quarter in 1960 to nearly half today. And most, I think, powerfully and importantly, what this has meant is that renters with incomes below the national median actually have less income after paying for housing today than they did, several decades ago. And so, they have. And what does that mean? That means that they have less income. They have less ability to put away any savings that can help them to weather shocks to expenses and shocks to income. And COVID has obviously been just such a shock. It has dealt an enormous blow. And our research at NYU, your research at the Furman Center, at the Urban Institute, Monique, and others' research shows that, that while the impact of the pandemic has been widespread, it's been particularly devastating to renters. And it has been particularly, who are more likely to work in the occupations and industries, basically, that are affected by COVID-related job loss. And additionally, we found that most of the households with workers in COVID vulnerable occupations were already rent burdened coming into the COVID crisis. And so this was, it sort of was a perfect storm, or a perfectly horrible storm, where not only did you have this just, devastating blow to the economy that's led to unprecedented levels of job loss, but it has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable. It has disproportionately affected workers of color, and it has disproportionately affected renters who are already struggling to pay rent.
Thank you, Ingrid. Similar to the housing affordability and homelessness crises in the country that, as you mentioned, really sort of preceded COVID-19, evictions were also already at epic levels in the US. Our research indicates that even before the coronavirus outbreak, nearly 11 million renters experienced severe housing cost burden. So paying more than half of their incomes towards rent. I think Diane mentioned some numbers around 60%. So many people were on the edge of missing rent payments and at risk of eviction. And we know that eviction leads to things like doubling up, overcrowding, and increases in homelessness. So I think it would make sense to sort of shift a little bit to Emily and ask Emily, can you talk a little bit about what the eviction crisis looked like in the US before COVID, and share some insights on the social and health impacts, the impacts that we don't often talk about enough of eviction?
Absolutely. Thank you, Monique. And just to tag on to the rent burden statistic that you shared, that burden goes up as a person's income goes down. So below the poverty line, 70%, 1 in 4 people are paying over 70% of their income toward the rent, which puts people at much greater risk of eviction, especially when an emergency happens. So the slightest thing like a flat tire or an unexpected health emergency can be the tipping point that sets someone into that eviction spiral and that housing insecurity and instability into the long run. Prior to the pandemic, there were approximately 7 evictions filed every minute in 2016, which is the last year that we have data for the entire country. So that's about 3.7 million in total. And that was when the unemployment rate was 4.7%. So when it shifted to 14.4% during the pandemic, that amounted to non-payment of rent in across the country that we haven't been able to recover from yet because of the lack of rent relief going to the back rent owed. And the failure to pay rent is by far the most common cause of eviction. Across 22 states tested, the median money judgment for cases was around $1,200. And that includes court fees, attorney's fees, late payments. So the actual amount that is due and that amounts to this eviction is usually a much smaller sum across the board. And it can be as low as $50, $120. That is the difference between being housed, doubling up, and homelessness. And during COVID-19, 50 million renters lived in households that reported COVID-19 related job or wage loss. So that is enough when you think about the lack of safety net entering the pandemic, especially for the populations hardest hit, to start that downward spiral and trajectory. And 43% of renter households with children have slight or no confidence in their ability to pay that rent. And that statistic is maintained throughout the pandemic, that 43% of renting families. What this means for renters, it's not just about moving and finding another place to live. Renters with evictions on their record are blacklisted by landlords, even if they win their case. They receive failing credit scores. They're precluded from public housing. So those hardest hit and in need of that assistance can't receive it. They're forced into rental housing with substandard conditions that threatens their health and their family's safety. And it almost always leads to a downward move, to a more disadvantaged neighborhood, to higher crime, to poor performing schools. And it overwhelmingly leads to unemployment, long-term residential instability, academic decline for children, and significant negative health consequences that are long-term in nature. So just this one act ends up shifting a person's livelihood and trajectory for decades to come, and can repeat that cycle because of the economic hardship that it also leads to. I just want to mention, for children, eviction is particularly traumatizing It affects their emotional and physical well-being and their development for years, and for some for a lifetime. It increases the likelihood of emotional trauma. It increases lead poisoning rates among people who are evicted, food insecurity, and again, academic decline at a time when the format of school has changed quite dramatically. And even for children whose mothers were evicted during pregnancy, they are much more likely to have adverse birth outcomes, so low birth weight or preterm pregnancies. So by allowing eviction to continue at the rates that it is, we're actually setting up future generations for harm and long-term failure.
Thank you, Emily. 7 evictions every minute, and the long-term impacts. I will come back to the looming eviction crisis because I think it's important, but I also want to take a moment to really sort of lift up the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on Black and Latinx individuals and households. Along with a colleague of mine, Marge Turner, I wrote a blog back in August about the growing evidence showing how the pandemic is disproportionately hurting Black and Latinx people. We argued that states and local leaders can and should take specific actions to address the pandemic's disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx households, regardless of whether there was a next federal stimulus aid package or not. Emily and Ingrid, you both sort of touched on this already, but can you share your thoughts and some insights about the disproportionate impact of COVID specifically on Black and Latinx renters, and some thoughts about how states and local jurisdictions can begin to think about how to stand up policies and programs that directly address these disparate impacts?
You want to go first, Emily?
Sure. So the COVID-19, both the housing crisis and the health crisis are both affecting people of color at a disproportionate rate. So we have widespread health inequity because of the eviction health outcomes as well as the COVID-19 rates. So prior to the pandemic, eviction affected Black households at twice the rate as white households. And in a study of multiple cities, approximately 80% of people facing eviction were Black. In some cities in America, the racial demographics of a population are a much greater indicator than the poverty rate of that population of whether or not they'll be evicted. With the greater the number of people of color, the higher the rate of eviction. And during the pandemic, the rates of Black and Hispanic renters who have slight or no confidence in their ability to pay next month's rent is over twice that of white renters as well. So again, going to be facing eviction at much higher rates. And then at the same time, the hospitalization rates are much higher. They're 4.7% more likely Black and Hispanic people than whites to be hospitalized. And the death rates are striking. Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous people are 2.3 to 1.75 times more likely than whites to die from COVID-19. And they're dying at a rate of white people a decade or more older than them. So these legal and policy responses that we're thinking about, they have to address these impacts and these root causes of the discrimination that we're seeing within this, and the health inequity and the disproportionate burden of the public health emergency on low-income communities, but especially communities of color and other marginalized groups.
Yeah, and I would just, really sobering and depressing. I will just add that looking at the labor market, I mean, a lot, not all of these disparities, but a number of them are rooted in the differences in the occupations and the industries where different groups work. So we estimated in New York that nearly half of Latinx wage earners and 38% of Black wage earners worked in COVID vulnerable occupations, as compared to less than a quarter of white wage earners. And, so in terms of sort of you also asked about the policy responses. I mean, in terms of, because of this disproportionate impact, that any efforts, policies, and programs to support vulnerable renters should also disproportionately help renters of color, but we can't, and those efforts are critical, but we can't sort of just stop there. I think we also need to make sure that the programs that that we adopt and the policies we enact are truly reaching communities of color. And I think I would say there's sort of, 4 or 5 things I'd say to lift up. I mean, one is the importance of outreach. That really important to get the word out. This is that much more complicated in a time of social distancing, and when you've got a digital divide. So how is it that you can make sure that people know about whatever assistance is out there, and that you get to the communities that are historically sort of, wary maybe of working with government and have a history of a lack of trust. Number 2 is strategic partnerships, making sure that local governments are partnering with nonprofits that work in communities that have been hard hit, and that may have more trust. That residents may trust them more than they do government. Third, I think effective communications. Communications is really important. That's obviously related to outreach, but I think making sure that language is simple, language is translated into, information is translated into multiple languages. And then I'd say fourth is just collecting data and tracking and monitoring. And so, both collecting data on the kind of underlying vulnerabilities to understand the communities that are likely to be hardest hit, and then make sure that you're targeting those with your communications and your outreach efforts and your partnerships. But then number 2, sort of using data and monitor to sort of monitor who actually is taking up these programs, and really ensuring that all communities are benefiting.
Monique, I just would like to add that the data that we're sharing, this disproportionate impact, the widespread health inequity among people of color, it's not an accident. It is due directly to the sordid history in our country of racially discriminatory laws and policies that have locked people out of this access. So these groups they entered the pandemic historically and systemically excluded from housing and economic opportunity. And that's why they're facing greater health and economic impact, because we didn't actually shift the public health response to account for that exclusion and to make sure that the marginalized communities of color, were engaged and protected and uplifted in the response. And this is clear in our failure to track some of the demographic data of people who were hospitalized at the outset of the pandemic, the inability to ensure that everyone has access to healthcare and access to hospitals in their communities to get the help they need when they needed it, and on from there. Just to add, everything that Ingrid said is fantastic. Just to add that I think that historically marginalized communities, in terms of solutions, must be engaged as leaders in the development of any interventions and the attainment of this health justice that we need to seek here. Because these efforts, they cannot be led by the communities who have benefited from the very forms of subordination that have to be dismantled in order for health equity to be achieved here.
Thank you, Emily. I think to your point, Diane said it best with the question up front, where she asked what happens when decades of structural racism collides with a pandemic. And I think what happens is we become disproportionately impacted as Black, Indigenous people of color. That's what happens. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing. So I appreciate the recommendations. I wrote down outreach, strategic partnerships, communications, data, and also true community engagement. And I think those are points that I wanted to lift up. And I think it's good because it sort of shifts us a little bit to talking about not just how bad it is, right? But what are the interventions and the programs that are out there that can be used to address the disproportionate impact. And I think it's a good segue to sort of talk about the fact that no one knows better how to do that than the state and local folks who are on the ground, right, who are at the forefront of this work. And so I think it's important to sort of note and shift gears a little bit that state and local governments have been doing work right now to address vulnerable renters and to address the root causes of eviction since the pandemic started. And I think, you know, an interesting local player in that has emerged as an administrator of the various rental assistance programs that have been lifted up are not ones that you would think of, but are state housing finance agencies. So it's a great way to sort of pivot. And I'd like to ask Stockton to talk a little bit about state HFAs, the work that they have been doing to sort of stand up these very contextualized that address issues like strategic partnerships, outreach, rental assistance programs in response to the crisis, and what have been some lessons learned from those interventions? Oh, Stockton, we can't hear you. Oh, technology. You know, let me, Stockton, are you still trying to connect? I'm going to give Stockton a chance.
I was going to say, do you want me to talk a little bit about local programs?
Let me give Stockton that would be great. I'm going
to give Stockton a chance to then jump in on the state side. So you know, we've actually been working with the University of Pennsylvania and the National Locum Housing Coalition to survey. It is really amazing. I feel like every week the number goes up, but now it's whatever 440 or something state and local programs. We've been focusing on the local programs across the country, and I just want to sort of lift up a few key lessons that we've learned. I think one thing is that it's just astounding that the efforts that all of these local government officials and state government officials have made to stand up these programs and to dramatically expand their rental assistance programs. You know, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about some, you know, I mean, they definitely have still faced challenges, not surprisingly, in sort of scaling up and then getting the money out the door. And I think there's sort of maybe 5 lessons that I would lift up. One is talking about outreach, sort of being creative about outreach, and trying to reach people early. I think there's lots of evidence that suggests if you can get to people sooner, that you're more likely to be able to help them and to before they really sort of accumulate so much debt that it really is going to, which is one of the things that's deeply troubling right now. The second is sort of simplification. Simplifying the application process. A lot of cities initially had very complicated application processes. They were really trying to make sure that they were screening people, and then it just was too burdensome for people. So I think simplifying it, and also just to build on Emily's point from before, I mean, really talking to residents to understand, talking to renters to understand what is it that's blocking them, what is making it difficult for them to use these programs, talking to landlords to understand the barriers. I think being prepared to be creative, to find ways to find the capacity to scale up to meet the need. You know, this is just you know, the need is just overwhelming, and sort of the existing staff is just not going to be able to be prepared to manage the wave, the really large wave of assistance needed. I think also kind of monitor and tracking implementations, using dashboards to and being nimble enough to course correct. And then I think also it's just finally sort of building relationships with landlords as well. That, you know, these programs, you know, in a sense, they really have two clients, right? They're helping renters, and you have to make sure the programs work for renters, but you also have to make sure that the programs work for landlords, especially small landlords that have much less experience working with government. So I'm hoping that Stockton, I stalled enough so that you can come in now. No, we
still can't hear you, Stockton.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit.
We can, a little bit.
Wow. I'm sorry. Let me give it a try, and somebody give me the hook if for some reason you can't hear me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and want to thank the Philadelphia and Cleveland Feds and Monique and my panelists, and also recognize the leadership of Diane Yentel and the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, which you know, has always been a big part of what I think of as the conscience and the heart of the affordable housing movement, and has really shown that to an extraordinary degree during the pandemic. I'm happy to talk about what the state housing finance agencies are doing, and Monique, is sort of a jumping off point to your observation that it was maybe somewhat surprising. I would agree, although I would say that the state HFAs have for many years run federal rental assistance programs for project-based contracts and housing choice vouchers, and actually almost half administered emergency shelter grants at the state level. So there was a track record there, but nothing that quite prepared any of us for what we've experienced for the last 7 months. And so we have been pleased to see the state housing finance agencies in 35 states so far mobilized to stand up emergency rental housing assistance programs. There's probably upwards of $2 billion in funding in those programs at this point. And most, to Diane's map, most are still accepting applications, although, as I'll talk about in a minute, the need in almost every state has been far greater than the resources that the states have had. A couple of broad observations about the programs, and there's a lot more information on NCSHA's website. Number one, all but one of the 35 that are in operation as of today are serving renters. There are 9, though, that are also serving homeowners. And we would note that in a number of places, state housing finance agencies are concerned about rising delinquencies and other stress on low-income homeowners. So we might come back, maybe there'll be a future Fed program on the home ownership stresses at the low end of the market, but most are clearly focused on renters. The main funding source for the state program so far has been the Coronavirus Relief Fund. This was the big amount of state and local aid in the CARES Act that states were given fairly wide ability to use, and has been the main source of these state housing finance agency programs so far. But there have been a lot of others, including the agency's own money in a number of cases and other HUD funds. The average program size is about 44 million. That's misleading because there are a handful of states that have quite large allocations. So the median is closer to 21 million, which is a significant amount of money. And there have been some good results. Florida has helped more than 10,000 households. For example, Iowa has put out more than $20 million in just a handful of weeks. But nevertheless, the need has been amazing. And you can just sort of pick a state. I mean, one that really illustrates it is Louisiana, which had 40,000 applications for help within 4 days of opening its program. In New Jersey, I think they had 60,000 applications in a matter of weeks. And these are applications, so it's for people who know that the resource exists. And we know that many folks aren't even aware in the early days that they even have a chance of accessing some help. This is not easy, even for agencies that have been around and running all kinds of programs for many decades. So there have been some challenges, and I would identify 3 that we might come back to. One is just putting in place the systems and the personnel and the technology to run brand new programs during a pandemic, I might add, when state HFAs, like everybody else, are having to deal with remote work environments and all the other challenges. The second has been dealing with requirements that were not so much imposed by Congress, because the CARES Act money has been reasonably flexible, but in many cases by state legislatures, governor's officers, and others that have put some additional bells and whistles on the money by the time the state HFA has had to have it. And then the third, and this is probably of great interest to my fellow panelists and many on the call, is making the right call on some policy questions about, for example, whether and to what extent a renter should show economic and housing need as a result of COVID-19 as being one criteria for eligibility for a program. I think you can have a very good discussion, maybe we will, about the merits and the drawbacks of doing that. But that's the kind of policy decision that on the fly, in a remote work environment and under enormous political pressure with overwhelming demand, the states are wrestling with. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of information on NCSHA's website. We're doing our best to track programs, experience, and pull out lessons learned. I think the last thing I'd say is to the excellent points of Ingrid and Emily on data and monitoring. States are doing their best. There are a lot of really important questions, particularly around beneficiaries, that do add yet another set of criteria to money you're trying to get out the door. And so again, it's sort of a judgment call, how much you ask and when. We know it's important. We know it will make programs better. We also know, though, that kind of heavy questions in that area can dissuade some from participating and create some other bureaucratic challenges. So good work, a delivery system that I think is performing quite well under the circumstances and is in position, if we're successful, and we're working very hard with Diane and others to get Congress to do the right thing, to get something like the amount of resource that's needed to deal with this problem.
Thank you, Stockton, and glad that we could hear you. You know, we're talking about sort of, and you mentioned this, like unprecedented resources, right? There really has been an unprecedented marshaling of resources at both the public, private, and philanthropic sectors, all aimed at trying to create interventions. But we also heard you and Diane talk about the fact that there's still a great degree more of need. I was looking at the recent report that your council put out about sort of looking at what that need would look like in January. And there was a particular line in the report that struck me, and it said, unprecedented in scale, the pandemic has created a demand shock, a supply shock, and a financial shock all at once. And we know, as Diane and Emily and Ingrid, everyone has mentioned, right, that though we have the CDC moratorium, it did not come with additional rental assistance. It really is just pressing a pause button, right? And eventually we all know that the rent is going to come due. I think there's a lot of conversation now around what that actually is going to look like. So Stockton, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that report and what, you know, you're sort of estimating that unpaid rent might look like in January. And then Emily and Ingrid, if you could speak to what the world looks like in January with this sort of rental cliff that we are marching towards without additional rental assistance or other interventions. So if we could start with Stockton and then Ingrid and then Emily, that would be great. And then I will try to make sure to turn over to these great Q&A questions we have coming in as well.
I'll be brief in my response. And first of all, just to say that it was really, I think, the work that Emily and the Eviction Lab and Diane and others did last spring and last summer, talking about the likelihood of an eviction wave that really started to catalyze policy attention to the issue that we face among those who weren't already aware. organization, the Congress and both parties and administration, it became clear to us that we needed additional quantitative analysis to try to make the case. And it's really sort of it's just indicating, I mean, eviction data can take a while to come together. It's probably not very well understood by non-experts. And in any event, the eviction is the worst case. It's not indicated of housing hardship. Long before that terrible event happens, a family is probably already sacrificed incredible stress and cut back on other critical spending and themselves in a very tenuous financial position. The second, though, is as lobbying efforts intensified over the summer, the administration and a number of Republicans started talking about evictions, realized that there was a problem coming. And so we saw the nationwide eviction moratorium, which sort of message in a way it's all a problem, but of course it's just kicking the can down the road. Rent ultimately does come due, as you said, Monique. So I was interested in trying to project some numbers on what that already was at the time of the moratorium and what it was likely to be, particularly for those who would really be in no position to pay it all back when the moratorium. So we commissioned a report from called Scout that had done some work for Emily earlier in the summer. And that's we're quite struggling. I mean, essentially, as of this September, anywhere between 13 and 17 billion was already owed, and that amount would rise above 30 billion under these projections by January, when the CDC eviction moratorium. Most of this falls on the people with the lowest incomes in the most vulnerable and impacted industries who are going to be least able to afford it. So we already started on evictions, and then more recently, we see similar analysis from the Mortgage Bankers Association on the unpaid rent burden, and from Moody's and others, and the great presentation today, starting to take different angles at this question. How big a bill is going to be owed when it comes due? And I think that's how to inject a sense of urgency into the discussions in Washington and in the states.
Thank you. Thank you. Ingrid?
Yeah, you know what, I think Emily, you should go first, just because your work has you've looked directly at this question nationally. We've looked in New York, but.
Great, that sounds great. And I will put into the chat the report that Stockton mentioned, so you can take a look yourself. That just to reiterate what he was saying, it broke up a little bit, is that by January, some estimations are that the rental debt owed will be between 25 and 34 billion. And that right now, multiple researchers have come to the number of around $13.6 billion currently owed in rental debt to property owners who are carrying that and at great expense to themselves and their families. So January, well, right now, we're looking at between 29 and 43% of renters are at risk of eviction. And just last week, Marketplace Edison research poll indicated that more than 64% of renters, 64%, fear missing a rent payment in the future. And that 20% of Americans had missed at least one rent payment since the pandemic had started. So for all of those Americans, they are at risk of eviction because that would be enough unless they cured to begin the process of the eviction cycle. And so come January, what I'm worried about is that it will be an invisible problem, that the majority of people will end up doubled up, transient, couch surfing. And what that means is that we will lose complete control over the pandemic itself. So in addition to all those health harms that I mentioned at the outset and what that will do to families, adults, and children, eviction is also directly connected with an increased contraction in mortality due to COVID-19. it increases the spread by forcing families into transiency and crowded residential environments. And we know from numerous studies that smaller crowded spaces increase the spread of respiratory disease. And the difference, for example, the difference between 45 square feet and 78 square feet of living space is associated with a 10-fold increase in infection. And that in most shelters in some cities, they're required to provide as little as 25 square feet of space per person. So you can see how these environments might make people more susceptible to disease, especially when the symptoms do not present themselves when a person can still be contagious. And at the same time, adding just 2 people to a household, because many people will try to stay with friends and family and exhaust those resources, adding just 2 people to a household doubles the rate of infection among people in the household and their risk as well. One study that did modeling out of the University of Pennsylvania, Mike Levy's group, they estimated at an eviction rate of 2%, which is much lower than what we're expecting right now or in January. So 2% per month works out to 8,000 additional COVID-19 cases per month if the seed of infected people was just 10. We have many more than 10, we know, across the country in any given community. And then another study reinforced that by showing that after controlling for mask orders, stay-at-home orders, school closures, testing rates, and numerous characteristics of the state, that lifting moratoriums, comparing a difference in different studies, so to states that did not lift their moratoriums, it amounted to 65,000 excess cases and nearly 5,000 excess deaths in only 18 months. So when we get to January, if we do not stop this eviction cliff, we are guaranteeing both the increase of COVID-19 across the country and also long-term hardship and the inability to recover from the economic crisis that has snowballed from the pandemic itself due to all of the long-term negative consequences and the inability to access opportunity that eviction itself creates. And much of this is triggered at the point of filing an eviction case. So even if the case itself is not fully realized and the sheriff executes that order, that many people will leave before the interaction with the court system itself.
Yeah, I just want to sort of just chime in and just sort of on that last point to just say that, you know, all of these numbers about eviction filings, I mean, they're arguably the tip of the iceberg, right? Because that we know that informal evictions and people leaving because they just realize they just can't cover the rent, that number could be much higher. And not to mention the fact that even the people that I feel like we're very, and I don't mean to be saying we shouldn't be focused on evictions, but there's a lot of pain beyond the eviction. And Stockton, I think you said that too, but you were a little garbled. And I just want to underscore that you know, you've got, I mean, it's going to be very difficult for families to recover from the amount of debt that they have, even if they're able to somehow stay in their home. So I think that's also something to really worry about.
Thank you. Emily, you mentioned a point, you were talking about households and just the burden, the 13 billion right now that's estimated potentially 30 billion in January, and also the sort of landlords, the folks who are carrying that cost as well right now. You know, we've talked a lot about renters, but there have been a lot of questions in the Q&A about landlords as well. So I don't want to lose that. Are there any programs that can help provide assistance to the sort of small mom and pop landlords during these COVID times? And are there any ongoing efforts to sort of help with mortgage payments to mitigate loss on those households as well? I would love if any of you could speak to that. And I will just add, you know, Urban has done some research about the large number of mom and pop landlords that are also Black, Indigenous people of color as well. So there's sort of wealth implications related to that as well. So I'm just curious, are any of you aware of programs that are addressing the sort of landlord end of this housing ecosystem?
Well, this is Stockton. I'll start on that. A number of the state housing finance agency programs are either aimed at landlords, and a really great example of one that's targeting smaller landlords is New Jersey's. But others like in Arizona and Mississippi and Kansas are also landlord oriented. It doesn't mean that the tenant doesn't have a real role, though. In some of these programs, it's sort of a joint application process. And so I think there is real attention to that. It's yet another one of those very tough policy and program design calls that have to be made quickly, whether that the program is really sort of more tenant or resident oriented or more landlord oriented or both. There are ways to do any of those approaches well. So it's not like there's only one right answer, but it's hard to come up with an answer that doesn't end up getting criticized pretty heavily by somebody. So what you see in a lot of the state HFA programs is partnerships with nonprofits, community action agencies, local governments, and others, as I think part of a way to get a community voice, if not always a resident voice, into the process, as well as enabling residents to have some control and some privacy or autonomy, as they are asked in many cases to provide a lot of sensitive information to strange bureaucratic systems that they may not be familiar with. And that's just all part of this process of outreach that has to continue.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I think there's some good examples in the sort of from the CDFI world of partnerships and programs to basically not only offer forbearance to landlords, but also to provide technical assistance and help them, give them the tools that enable them to work out, effective payment plans and communicate with best practices and communicating with tenants.
At the peak of the eviction moratoriums that we had across the country at the state level, there were 43 moratoriums in place, and about a third of them included foreclosure and mortgage forbearance programs, and also tax relief. So that was really designed to protect the property owner. And it's a real risk. If the rent isn't paid, the mortgage isn't paid, the property taxes go unpaid, the community resources start to dwindle, and then the property owner is at risk of foreclosure. And so for the small property owners, where 56% lack access to credit to cover emergency expenses, this is a real risk that we'll lose those properties, that they will suffer financial harm, and have a long-term impact and slide down the socioeconomic scale along with their tenants. There were a few programs that have been re-implemented from the Great Recession that were successful then, mostly restructuring loans, to Ingrid's point, or the time of the mortgage. And this was the loss mitigation strategy in 2008. But then also more recently, the American Bar Association has issued guidance stating that COVID-19 should qualify for enactment of most force majeure clauses that would allow them to restructure and refinance their mortgages as well. So some interventions, but ultimately I think the best way to stem the tide here is to really infuse the housing market with rental assistance, and especially to pay the back rent owed.
Thank you. There was another question in the Q&A as well around HUD housing counseling agencies and how they might be leveraged. I sort of want to lump that in with a question too around, are there any programs that you're aware of right now to sort of stave off eviction altogether, like to get more involved earlier on in the process? So Stockton, the question around HUD housing counseling agencies was directed to you around capacity. Given the concerns you raised around scaling up. And then Ingrid or Emily, feel free to address the question too about eviction prevention.
There are about a half a dozen state HFA emergency housing assistance programs that allow for funds to be used for housing counseling and similar kinds of support services. And if you're interested in the specific states, I'm happy to follow up with you.
Great, great. Emily or Ingrid, anything around sort of eviction prevention programs or some examples earlier in the process?
The National Center for State Courts is a really great resource, especially around diversion programs. They've done a good job tracking those, and they've highlighted the Michigan diversion program quite a bit. The strength of that program, partially because it's evidence-based, so we know the outcomes, but the strength of that program is that it varies by community. So it really takes into account the community assets and resources, and it couples rental assistance with legal counsel, with mediation, with community resources to help better understand what social supports a family needs in order to stay housed or to seek employment and to become stable in their housing and their environment. I think to address this looming eviction crisis, to provide for supports during the pandemic, the interventions that are mandating healthy behaviors. So the stay at home, the shelter in place, the ability to clean your protective equipment, it has to be accompanied by supports to enable compliance and minimize harms. And so that means that if we're going to mandate that individuals minimize their contact with others, that we have to give them the ability to shelter in place. We have to give them safe and decent housing to do so. And then also access to healthcare at the individual and community level. So this safe and decent housing requires eviction moratoriums that are robust, that freeze every stage of eviction, especially the filing stage where the harm really sets in, and that those need to be accompanied by additional supports like preventing late fees, preventing rent raises, allowing for payment plans, and also providing the prohibition on credit reporting and the ability to use the record to screen tenants in the future. This is such an extraordinary period in history that people cannot be held responsible for the economic downturn. And that should not be the reason that they have this downward slide into health harms and poor environments. So I think that in addition to the moratoriums, though, they have to be coupled with this rental assistance, with foreclosure, mortgage forbearance, and supports for the property owners to enable them to thrive at the same time, because they shouldn't have to carry the burden of this either. And where that's not enough, we can start to really reform the eviction system itself. It's a very inequitable system with 90% of tenants being unrepresented and 90% of landlords receiving representation. And we know that if you insert equal representation, eviction filings drop by 34% and 84% of tenants actually remain in their homes. So I think there are a number of resources and really good examples of how to start reforming this system that we can start to be a little bit more deliberate in applying those today.
Monique, could I just pick up on some of what I think you were getting at and what Emily was speaking to, and just on time urgency here?
Go ahead, 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Here's the deal. Even if Congress and the administration were to agree today on a stimulus package with a big amount of money for emergency rental assistance, it would be some number of months before those dollars were actually available to renters and landlords. And Congress and the administration are nowhere close to agreeing, let alone sending legislation to be signed into law. So we need to continue that advocacy. Reminds us, also planning for the very real likelihood that come January 1, the CDC eviction moratorium will end. State moratoria, in many cases that have been extended, will be coming to an end as well. Other solutions have to be brought to bear while we continue to make the case for congressional aid.
Thank you, Stockton. I think that was worth the 20 seconds. Unfortunately, I can't believe it, but we are at the end of our time. So given the timing, I just want to thank each of you so very much. The discussion was not only incredibly timely, but also incredibly informative. I was going to give some time for closing remarks, but I think we're going to transition over, and I just want to thank you again, and then I want to turn it back to Ken, who will close from the Cleveland Fed. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. My name is Ken Surratt. I'm the outreach manager for the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. Here to just provide some brief closing remarks as well as some well-deserved thank yous, and I'll start there. First, Jimmy and Teresa, thank you so much for inviting us to be partners on this webinar and taking this idea and making it a reality. Diane, Hal, and Davin, you did the perfect job sharing the context and setting up this very robust and engaging panel discussion. And to our panel, these esteemed experts, Emily, Ingrid, and Stockton, thank you for your comments. Definitely heard how housing security was a problem even prior to the pandemic, and it just escalated with the job losses and shutdowns of COVID. And hearing about the disproportionate rate impact on Black and Latinx renters and the lasting health and social impacts is really a cause for further concern. Hopefully, interventions such as moratoriums and rent assistance can continue to hold off this expected wave, and that ideally other interventions coming maybe could keep and mitigate what we're seeing as a large amount of debt piling up and a large amount of potential evictions and families at risk. Monique, what can I say? You did a masterful job moderating the discussion and sharing insights from your experiences. It was very valuable to this panel. So what's next? The moratorium ends on December 31st. A lot of the money allocated to rental assistance has been spent or is on the way out the door, as we heard. And unfortunately, this means that many households are still at risk. As Teresa said at the beginning, the Federal Reserve Banks of Cleveland and Philadelphia look forward to working together to follow the topic of evictions and are planning future discussions to share what we learn. So stay tuned for that and these upcoming discussions. The last thank you is to our audience for caring about such an important topic and supporting our work. So please take a few more minutes and complete the post-event evaluation that you will receive immediately after the event. And my last reminder is that this webinar was recorded and will be available shortly after the conclusion of this event. So with that, thank you. That concludes our program, and I hope that you all have a great afternoon.